I've never told anyone these stories before. Not my family, not my therapist, not even the other veterans at the support group. They wouldn't believe me anyway. After 10 years in the army, I've seen things that defy explanation. Things that make me question my own sanity. But I need to write this down, to get it out somehow. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. It started in 2008 at Forward Operating Base Echo, a remote outpost tucked into the Hindu Kush Mountains. I was a staff sergeant then, leading a squad of 12 men. The base itself was nothing special, a collection of reinforced buildings, barriers, and guard towers perched on a plateau that overlooked a winding valley road. But there was something wrong with that place, something that had been there long before we arrived. The first signs were subtle. Supplies would go missing from locked containers. Not the usual stuff that gets pilfered, no cigarettes or snacks, but random items. A box of mechanical pencils, 3 left boots, all different sizes, a broken radio that was waiting to be disposed of. We blamed it on tired soldiers making mistakes in inventory or local workers with sticky fingers. We were wrong. Then the dream started. At first, just a few soldiers reported having the same nightmare. They were wandering through an endless cave system, following the sound of dripping water and something else. Something that sounded like singing, but not quite human. Within 2 weeks, almost everyone on base was having the dream. The base psychiatrist said it was just stress, the isolation getting to us. He stopped saying that after he started having the dreams too. Private First Class Thompson was the first to see it. He was pulling guard duty in Tower 3, the one that overlooked the steep cliff face behind the base. It was around 3 a.m. when he radioed in, voice shaking. He reported movement along the cliff wall, something big, moving in a way that didn't make sense. By the time his squad leader reached the tower, Thompson was gone. His rifle was still there, along with his night vision goggles and radio. The only strange thing was his notebook, open to a page filled with the same symbol drawn over and over, overlapping until the paper was nearly black with ink. We found him 3 days later, wandering in a drainage culvert 2 miles from base. He had no memory of where he'd been, but his boots were covered in a strange, phosphorescent mud that none of us had ever seen before. The lab results came back inconclusive. Thompson was evacuated for psychological evaluation, and we were ordered not to discuss the incident. But things only got worse after that. The dreams became more vivid. In my own, I started seeing details that felt too real. Ancient stone corridors carved with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. Chambers filled with strange machinery that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I started noticing things when I was awake too. The way the ground sometimes trembled beneath our feet, but never registered on any seismic equipment. The strange lights that would appear on our thermal imaging cameras, moving through solid rock as if it were air. It all came to a head one night in late October. I was leading a routine security patrol around the base perimeter with specialists Anderson and Rivera. The moon was full, casting sharp shadows across the rocky ground. We'd done this patrol 100 times before, but something felt different that night. The air was thick, heavy with an electricity that made our hair stand on end. We were approaching the southeastern corner of the perimeter when Rivera stopped dead in his tracks. He was our best soldier, steady under fire, never rattled by anything. But that night, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Sergeant," he whispered, "do you hear that?" At first I heard nothing but the usual night sounds, the distant hum of generators, the wind whistling through the rocks. Then it hit me, a low-frequency vibration, more felt than heard, pulsing through the ground and into our bones. It was like standing next to a massive subwoofer playing a tone too deep for human ears. Anderson reached for his radio, but it was dead. All of our comms were down. Even our flashlights started flickering, the beams growing weaker by the second. That's when we saw the crack. It started as a hairline fracture in the rocky ground, barely visible in the moonlight. But as we watched, it began to widen, spreading like a wound opening in the earth. That phosphorescent mud we'd found on Thompson's boots was seeping up through the crack, giving off a sickly green glow that made my stomach turn. "Fall back," I ordered, but my voice sounded wrong, distorted as if I was speaking underwater. Anderson turned to run, and that's when we saw them. Hundreds of similar cracks spreading across the ground, forming a pattern that was too precise to be natural. It looked like a giant circuit board etched into the earth, glowing with that same nauseating light. Rivera was the first to notice the shadows weren't moving right. The moonlight was casting them in the wrong direction, and they seemed to be growing darker, more solid. As we watched in horror, the shadows began to pull themselves up from the ground, taking on three-dimensional form. I've spent years trying to find the right words to describe what they looked like. The closest I can get is this. Imagine a person's shadow decided to stand up and walk around. Now imagine that shadow was folded wrong, like a piece of origami made by someone who'd never seen what they were trying to create, only heard it described. They moved like stop-motion animation, jerky and unnatural. Anderson screamed. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and I raised my rifle. The shadows were moving toward us now, gliding over the cracked ground. I opened fire, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the scene. The bullets passed right through them, impacting the rocks behind with sharp cracks. "Run," I shouted, and this time my men listened. We sprinted back toward the base, our boots crunching on ground that felt increasingly unstable. The shadows followed, but they didn't move like we did. They flowed across the terrain like spilled oil, spreading and reforming. Rivera was fast, but not fast enough. One of the shadows reached him, wrapping around his legs like dark water. He fell hard, his rifle clattering away. I turned back, reaching for him, but Anderson grabbed my arm. "Look," he gasped. The ground beneath Rivera was opening, not cracking or collapsing, but opening like a mouth. The phosphorescent mud was everywhere now, soaking into his uniform as he thrashed and screamed. The shadows held him down as he sank into the earth, still fighting. The last thing I saw was his hand reaching up, fingers spread wide, before the ground closed over him like it had never opened at all. Anderson and I made it back to the base, but no one believed what we'd seen. How could they? The night shift commander sent out a search party for Rivera, but they found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no sign of the cracks or the glowing mud. Even our own boots were clean. The only evidence something had happened was Rivera's rifle, lying in the dirt where he'd dropped it. The official report listed him as missing in action. His family was notified, condolence letters were written, and life on the base was supposed to return to normal. But I couldn't let it go. Neither could Anderson. We started digging into the base's history in our off hours. FOB Echo had been established in 2006, but we discovered something strange. 3 other military outposts had been built on the same plateau since World War II. Each one had been suddenly abandoned within 2 years of construction. The official records cited various reasons: structural instability, logistical challenges, strategic repositioning. But in each case, there were reports of missing personnel and equipment. Then we found the photographs. They were buried in an old file cabinet in the base's records room, black and white images from 1944 when the first outpost was built. Most were typical military documentation, but one stopped my heart. It showed a group of army engineers standing around what appeared to be a cave entrance. On the rock wall beside them were carved symbols, the exact same symbols from Thompson's notebook, the ones he'd drawn over and over after his disappearance. Anderson couldn't sleep after that. He spent his nights poring over geological surveys and old maps, convinced there was something beneath the base. I tried to tell him to let it go, that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Then he missed morning formation. I found his room torn apart. Papers covered every surface, the walls plastered with drawings and maps. On his desk was a journal, the last entry dated 3:27 a.m. that morning. It read, "I can hear them singing. They're waiting in the deep dark. They've always been waiting. The door is open now." But it was what I found under his bunk that chilled me to my core, a piece of broken concrete from the base's foundation. He'd been digging at night, secretly excavating beneath the building. The hole wasn't large, barely big enough for a man to squeeze through, but it was there, and from its depths came that same low-frequency vibration we'd felt the night Rivera disappeared. I should have reported it immediately, should have had the hole filled in and Anderson arrested for demolishing government property. Instead, I did the stupidest thing possible. I went back that night with a rope and flashlight. What I found down there, what I saw in those ancient tunnels. The hole opened into a narrow shaft that descended at a steep angle. The concrete gave way to natural rock, but there was something wrong about it. The surfaces were too smooth, almost polished, with those same bizarre symbols carved at regular intervals. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. The deeper I went, the stronger that vibration became. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I could hear it now, a deep thrumming that made my teeth ache. The air grew thick and stale, with an underlying smell like ozone and wet copper. After about 50 feet, the shaft opened into a larger chamber. I nearly dropped my flashlight when I saw the walls. They were covered in what looked like circuit boards, but they were made of some kind of stone or metal I'd never seen before. Thin lines of that phosphorescent material ran through them like veins, pulsing in time with the vibration. The patterns were impossibly complex, spiraling and interconnecting in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. But it was what lay in the center of the chamber that made my blood run cold. A perfect sphere about 10 feet in diameter, hovering silently above the ground. It was made of the same material as the walls, but the patterns on its surface were moving, shifting like living things. As I watched, paralyzed, I realized I could almost understand them, like watching someone write in a language you almost know. Then I saw the bodies. They were suspended in alcoves around the chamber, held in place by what looked like strands of living shadow. Some were recent. I recognized Thompson, still in his uniform, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. Others were older, much older. A soldier in what I II gear, his flesh mummified but preserved. What looked like a British cavalry officer from the 1800s, his red coat still bright despite the years. And Rivera, God, Rivera, he was there, but he wasn't right anymore. His body was twisted, reformed, like clay molded by invisible hands. His skin had taken on the same qualities as the walls, those horrible patterns crawling across its surface. His eyes were open too, but they weren't human eyes anymore. They were pools of that phosphorescent light, and they were looking right at me. His mouth opened, and what came out wasn't a human voice. It was that singing we'd heard in our dreams, but layered with something else. The sound of stone grinding on stone, of ancient machinery coming to life. And underneath it all, I could hear him screaming. I ran. I don't remember dropping the rope or the flashlight. I don't remember climbing back up the shaft or sealing the hole with sandbags and debris. The next clear memory I have is sitting in my bunk at dawn, my uniform covered in that strange mud that had already started to fade away like it had never existed. 3 days later, Anderson's body was found in the mountains, 5 miles from base. The official cause of death was exposure, but that didn't explain why his eyes had turned to solid crystal, or why his blood had been replaced with that glowing mud. It didn't explain the symbols carved into his bones, visible on the x-rays but gone when they did the autopsy. Command launched an investigation, but it was different from the usual military inquiries. The investigators wore civilian clothes and carried no identification. They asked strange questions, not about Anderson's death or Rivera's disappearance, but about dreams, about the symbols, about whether any of us had experienced lost time or hearing the singing. One night, I was pulled from my bunk by 2 of these investigators. They took me to the command center, but the room had been transformed. The walls were covered with maps, not just of Afghanistan, but of places all over the world. Red pins marked locations across every continent, each connected by strings that formed patterns eerily similar to the circuits we'd found underground. That's when they told me the truth. FOB Echo wasn't just another military outpost. It was built here specifically because of what lay beneath it. The army had known about these sites since World War II, places where the barrier between our world and something else had grown thin. They'd been studying them, trying to understand what was on the other side, trying to use them. They showed me files dating back decades, reports of similar incidents across the globe, strange disappearances, soldiers transformed, ancient machines found buried in the earth. Each site had its own sphere, its own circuit patterns, its own horrors, but they were all connected, part of something larger, something older than humanity itself. The investigator asked if I'd seen anything in the chamber besides the sphere and the bodies. I lied. I didn't tell them about the glimpse I'd caught in the sphere's reflective surface, a vast city of impossible geometry where the shadows had weight and substance, where time flowed in all directions at once. I didn't tell them about the brief moment when I understood what the patterns meant, what they were building toward. The next day, orders came down. The base was being decommissioned. We were all being transferred to different units, scattered across the globe. The official story was strategic restructuring, but we knew the truth. They were trying to break up anyone who knew what had happened, separate us before we could piece it all together. Before I left, I went back to the hole one last time. It had been filled with concrete, the floor above it replaced. But pressing my ear to the ground, I could still hear it, that deep vibration, that otherworldly singing, and something else. The sound of machines coming to life, of ancient gears turning with terrible purpose. I've been out of the army for 3 years now, but I still keep track of the others who were at FOB Echo. Most have disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. The ones who are left don't talk about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I'll get a phone call from one of them. No words, just that same haunting song playing faintly in the background. And the dreams haven't stopped. They're clearer now, more detailed. In them, I see those spheres awakening all over the world. I see the shadows taking form, reaching out, reshaping reality itself. And I see Rivera's transformed face, his crystalline eyes reflecting a future that's drawing closer every day. Because the thing we found beneath FOB Echo wasn't just a doorway or a machine, it was a key. And somewhere out there, right now, something is turning in the lock. Baghdad, 2009. 6 months after the FOB Echo incident, the army had shuffled me to Iraq, thinking distance might make me forget what I'd seen in those underground chambers. I was assigned to a new unit conducting sweep operations in the city's industrial district, an endless maze of abandoned factories and warehouses. The day it started was brutally hot, even by Iraqi standards. The thermometer on our Humvee read 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the body armor felt like it was cooking us alive. We were clearing buildings along a stretch of road that had seen heavy fighting earlier in the war. Most structures were just burned out shells, their walls scarred by bullets and shrapnel. That's when Corporal Mitchell spotted the warehouse. It looked different from the others, less damaged, with thick concrete walls that had somehow escaped the bombing. The loading bay doors were chained shut, but a small side entrance stood slightly ajar. Standard procedure was to mark it for later inspection, but something about the building pulled at me, the same kind of pull I'd felt at FOB Echo. Our 4-man team made entry. The interior was pitch black, our flashlight beams cutting through decades of dust. The warehouse floor was empty, except for a few rusted storage racks, but a metal staircase led up to what looked like an office area. And that's where we found it, the radio. It sat on a desk in the corner office, covered in a thick layer of dust. One of those old military field radios from the 1940s, the kind that could survive a direct hit from a mortar. It looked completely out of place in a modern Iraqi warehouse. Mitchell, our communications specialist, was immediately interested. "These things were built to last," he said, wiping away the dust. "Probably still works." He shouldn't have touched it. None of us should have even been in that room. But we didn't know then what we know now. The radio had no power source, no batteries, no power cord, nothing. But when Mitchell touched it, it crackled to life. Static at first, then fragments of voices breaking through the white noise. "Could be picking up local transmissions," Mitchell suggested, but his voice trembled slightly. We all knew modern military communications use different frequencies entirely. This radio shouldn't have been able to pick up anything. Then we heard the first clear transmission, a young voice speaking English with a Midwestern accent. "Baker Company, we're taking heavy fire. They're coming through the wire. Request immediate support at..." The transmission cut off in static, then returned. June 6, 1944. God help us, they're everywhere. My blood ran cold. That was a transmission from D-Day, from Normandy 65 years ago. Before any of us could speak, another voice broke through. November 1967, Dak To. Charlie's got us surrounded. I count at least 15 casualties. Vietnam. The voices kept coming, bleeding through each other. Korea, Desert Storm, Afghanistan. Soldiers' last transmissions from every major conflict of the past century, all playing simultaneously on a radio that shouldn't have worked at all. Private Cooper reached for the power knob, but Mitchell stopped him. "Wait," he said. "Listen." Through the chaos of overlapping transmissions, a new voice emerged. This one was different, clearer, more immediate. "This is Sergeant James Kelly, 3rd Infantry Division. My coordinates are..." The voice listed our exact location. "3 men will die here tomorrow at 14:37 hours. The shadows are coming for them. They always come for them." We all recognized the name. Sergeant Kelly had been killed in this very district 2 weeks ago, his patrol hit by an IED. But this transmission, it was live, active. And it was coming through a radio that was dead, had been dead for decades. Mitchell started taking the radio apart, hands shaking. Inside, where there should have been circuits and wiring, we found something else. The components were made of the same strange material I'd seen in the chambers beneath FOB Echo. That metallic stone with its shifting, impossible patterns. And threading through it all were thin veins of that familiar phosphorescent substance, pulsing like living things. "We need to report this," Cooper said, already reaching for his radio. But when he keyed his mic, all he got was that same ghostly static. Our modern communications were dead, while this relic from another war kept broadcasting its impossible messages. The voices changed again. Now they were calling out names. Soldiers in our unit. Each name followed by a date and time of death. Some had already happened. Others were still to come. Private Michael Cooper, July 15, 2009, 14:37 hours. Specialist David Mitchell, July 15, 2009, 14:37 hours. Sergeant William Torres, July 15, 2009, 14:37 hours. Tomorrow, all 3 of my men scheduled to die tomorrow at the exact same time. My name never came through the radio. Somehow, that was worse. I ordered everyone out of the building, but Mitchell refused to leave the radio behind. He wrapped it in his spare t-shirt and shoved it in his pack. "We need proof," he insisted. "Command needs to see this." The walk back to base was tense. Every few minutes the radio would crackle in Mitchell's pack, spitting out fragments of battles long past mixed with predictions of deaths yet to come. Each transmission ended with that same phrase: "The shadows are coming for them. They always come for them." Back at base, we secured the radio in a storage container and posted a guard. I spent half the night writing up my report, trying to explain what we'd found without sounding insane. Just before dawn, I finally fell into an uneasy sleep. The explosion woke me. The storage container had detonated, leaving nothing but twisted metal and scorched concrete. No trace of the radio was found in the wreckage. The guard swears no one approached the container all night. But somehow, at 0600 hours, every radio on base suddenly activated. Through each one came a single message, in that same clear voice: 7 hours, 37 minutes remaining. The shadows are hungry today. I gathered Cooper, Mitchell, and Torres in my quarters. The radio's prediction gave them all less than 8 hours to live. I couldn't just sit by and watch it happen. "We're locking down," I told them. "No one leaves this room until after 14:37 hours. It seemed logical. If they were predicted to die somewhere in the industrial district, keeping them on base should change that fate. Around 1000 hours, the radio started again, every single one on base, all broadcasting simultaneously, but now it was just strings of numbers, repeated over and over. Mitchell, still our comms expert despite everything, recognized them first. "Grid coordinates," he said, his face pale. "They're marking locations all over the city." We plotted them on a map. The points formed a pattern, the same circuit-like design I'd seen at FOB Echo, and our base was at the center. 1200 hours. The broadcasts changed again. Now they were playing what sounded like murder scenes. Gunshots, screams, the sound of bodies falling. But underneath it all was that same vibration I'd felt in the caves. That deep mechanical humming that made your teeth ache. Torres broke first. "This is insane," he said, grabbing his weapon. "I'm not sitting here waiting to die." Before I could stop him, he'd bolted from the room. Mitchell and Cooper went after him. I tried to follow, but the door slammed shut. The handle wouldn't turn. For 15 minutes, I fought with it, listening to the chaos erupting outside. Every radio on base was at full volume now, that horrible humming growing louder and louder. When the door finally opened, the base was deserted. No guards at their posts, no personnel in the offices, just empty buildings and hundreds of radios, all broadcasting in perfect synchronization. I found a Humvee with the keys still in it and drove into the city. The coordinates on the map led me to that same warehouse where we'd found the radio, but it had changed. The concrete walls were covered in those familiar symbols, glowing with that sickly phosphorescent light. Inside, I found them, all of them, every soldier from the base. They stood in perfect circles around a central point, completely motionless, and there, floating above them, was the radio. Not the old military one we'd found, but something that only looked like it. Its casing had peeled away, revealing the same sphere I'd seen beneath FOB Echo. 1437 hours came with a sound I'll never forget. Like reality itself tearing open, the sphere pulsed, and those familiar shadows began pouring out, wrapping around the motionless soldiers. But they weren't just shadows anymore. They had depth, substance, like holes cut in the fabric of space. Cooper, Mitchell, and Torres were in the innermost circle. I watched in horror as the shadows touched them. Their bodies didn't just die, they unraveled. It started with their skin, peeling away in strips that dissolved into darkness. Then muscle, bone, everything breaking down into that same phosphorescent material I'd seen before. The others began changing too. Some turned to crystal like Anderson had, others twisted and reformed like Rivera. A few simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but empty uniforms and dog tags. The radio, or what had been the radio, spoke one last time, but now I understood what we were really hearing. It wasn't picking up transmissions from the past. It was collecting them, recording the deaths of soldiers throughout history, storing their final moments like batteries storing energy. Those voices we'd heard, they weren't recordings. They were souls trapped in that terrible machine. Every death it predicted was another soul added to its collection. And the patterns, the coordinates it had given us, they were forming a key just like at FOB Echo. Another door being opened. I found myself walking forward, unable to stop. The shadows reached for me but didn't touch me. Instead, they showed me things, visions. I saw other radios, other spheres, other collections scattered across the world. Each one gathering souls, building power, waiting for some signal I couldn't understand. The humming reached a crescendo and the sphere began to change. It cracked open like an egg, revealing something inside. Something that wore light like we wear skin, that moved in dimensions I couldn't comprehend. It looked at me with eyes that weren't eyes and spoke with a voice that wasn't a voice. "Witness," it said. "Record, survive. The collection must continue." Then everything went white. I woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany. They told me my entire unit had been killed in a massive explosion at the warehouse, a suspected insurgent attack. But there were no bodies recovered, just empty uniforms, melted dog tags, and hundreds of old military radios scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those transmissions, not from any radio, but in my head. The voices of the dead, calling out their names and times of death. And underneath it all, that horrible humming, growing louder every year. Because the radio wasn't destroyed that day, it's still out there, still collecting, still growing stronger. And sometimes, when I drive past old military surplus stores or antique shops, I'll see it in the window, just sitting there, waiting for someone to touch it, to give it power, to feed it more souls. But the worst part is that I know now what it's building toward, what all these spheres and patterns and collections are for. And I know that when it finally happens, when that last soul is collected and that final door opens, God help us all. South Korea, winter of 2010. After the Iraq incident, the army tried burying me in bureaucracy, assigning me to a training unit far from any active combat zones. They thought teaching young soldiers basic maneuvers would keep me away from the things I'd seen. They were wrong. We were conducting cold weather training near the DMZ, teaching troops how to survive in sub-zero temperatures and deep snow. The area was riddled with old bunkers from various wars, most of them mapped and cleared decades ago. I was leading a squad through navigation exercises when Private Jenkins discovered the entrance. He'd fallen through a snowdrift into what looked like an old drainage tunnel, but the construction was different from anything I'd seen before. The walls were lined with that same polished stone I'd encountered at FOB Echo and in that warehouse in Baghdad. My first instinct was to radio it in, seal the area off, but before I could key my mic, I heard that familiar humming coming from deep within the tunnel, and underneath it, something else, a human voice crying out for help. The squad wanted to go in immediately. They were young, eager, hadn't yet learned that some cries for help are better left unanswered. But I was their sergeant, responsible for their lives. I ordered everyone back, except Corporals Park and Rodriguez, my two most experienced soldiers. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, the walls covered in frost that seemed to form those same circuit-like patterns I'd seen before. Our flashlight beams barely penetrated the darkness, as if the air itself was absorbing the light. Then we found the first body. The body wore a U.S. Army uniform from the Korean War era, perfectly preserved in the freezing temperatures, but something was wrong with it. The flesh had a metallic sheen, like it had been plated in some kind of alloy. The dog tags around its neck were melted into the skin, the metal and flesh fused together in a way that defied explanation. "Sergeant," Park whispered, her voice shaking. "Look at his face." The soldier's eyes were open, crystalline like Anderson's had been, but these weren't just transformed by whatever killed him. They were modified, mechanical. Tiny gears and circuits were visible through the transparent crystals, still moving slightly, as if they were trying to focus on something only they could see. The cry for help came again, echoing through the tunnel. It sounded closer now, but somehow wrong, like multiple voices trying to speak in unison, but slightly out of sync. The tunnel opened into a large chamber that could only have been a laboratory. Banks of ancient computers lined the walls, their screens somehow still glowing with that sickly phosphorescent light. Cables as thick as my arm ran from the computers into metal tanks filled with cloudy liquid, and floating in those tanks. I've spent years trying to forget what I saw in those tanks. They might have been human once, or at least started that way. Their bodies were a patchwork of flesh, metal, and crystal, transformed by whatever experiments had been conducted here. Some still moved, twitching in their preservation fluid. Others had burst out of their tanks entirely, leaving trails of that glowing liquid across the floor. Rodriguez found the files, hundreds of folders, documenting something called Project Amalgam, a joint program between US and Korean military scientists starting in 1952. They were trying to create enhanced soldiers, using technology they'd discovered in places like FOB Echo, places where the barrier between worlds had grown thin. The reports detailed how they'd exposed test subjects to the spheres, to the shadows, trying to harness whatever power lay on the other side. Most subjects died horribly, some transformed into the things we saw in the tanks, and a few achieved what the scientists were looking for. But something went wrong. The files ended abruptly in 1954 after an incident labeled only as breakthrough event. The final report contained just 3 words, written in shaking hand. They broke through. That's when we heard the scraping sound behind us. The sound came from one of the larger tanks at the back of the lab. Its glass was frosted over, obscuring whatever was inside. But as we watched, a hand pressed against the glass from within. A human hand, at first. Then it began to change. The flesh rippled like liquid metal, fingers elongating into gleaming talons that scraped against the glass with a sound that made my teeth hurt. The frost on the tank began to melt, revealing what was inside. It might have been a soldier once. The tattered remains of a uniform still clung to its transformed body, but where there should have been skin, there was living metal that flowed and shifted like mercury. Its face was a nightmare of crystal and chrome, with dozens of those mechanical eyes whirring and focusing independently, and when it saw us, all those eyes locked onto our position at once. "Run," I whispered, but it was too late. The tank exploded outward, showering us with glass and preservation fluid. The creature unfolded itself, growing larger as it moved, its body reconfiguring like some horrible living puzzle. More shapes moved in the darkness behind it, other test subjects awakening from their decades-long sleep. Park opened fire. The bullets hit the creature's metallic skin and were absorbed, like stones dropping into a pool of liquid metal. It reached for her with an arm that split into dozens of writhing tendrils. Rodriguez grabbed her, pulling her back toward the tunnel entrance, but I couldn't move, because in that moment, all of those mechanical eyes focused on me and I heard its voice in my head. "Brother," it said, but not in English or Korean. It spoke in that same language of patterns I'd seen in the sphere, the one that hurt to understand. "You've touched them too, been marked by them, join us. The metamorphosis is only beginning." Behind it, more tanks were breaking open, the air filled with that familiar vibration, so strong it made the computers spark and crash. And through one of the broken screens, I saw something that made my blood freeze, a current map of military bases around the world, each one marked with the same symbols I'd seen at FOB Echo, each one built over something ancient and horrible. The thing that used to be a soldier kept coming closer, its body leaving trails of living metal across the floor. "They chose us," it said. "Chose you too. The transformation can't be stopped now. The doors are opening everywhere." The creature's words triggered something in my memory. The symbols from FOB Echo, the patterns in Baghdad. They weren't just writing or circuits, they were blueprints, plans for turning human beings into something else. Park's scream snapped me back to reality. One of the other creatures had emerged behind us, cutting off our escape route. This one was different. Its body was mostly crystal, transparent enough to see the modified organs inside, all whirring and pulsing with that phosphorescent light. "Grenades," I shouted. "Now." We each pulled a frag grenade, our last desperate option. The metal creature laughed in my head, a sound like grinding gears and breaking glass. "Your weapons mean nothing," it said. "They meant nothing in 1954 when they tried to destroy us. We've had decades to evolve." That's when I noticed something. Where the preservation fluid had spilled, the frost patterns on the floor had melted, and underneath I could see more of those symbols carved into the stone. They were glowing faintly, pulsing in sync with the creature's movements. "The floor," I yelled to Park and Rodriguez. "Target the floor." We pulled the pins and threw. The creatures moved to intercept the grenades, their bodies stretching and flowing like quicksilver. But they didn't realize our true target. The explosions ripped through the ancient stone, shattering the symbols carved there. The effect was immediate. The creatures screamed, a sound that existed somewhere between radio static and tearing metal. Their bodies began to lose cohesion, the living metal and crystal starting to crumble. "Run, don't look back." We sprinted for the tunnel entrance as the lab descended into chaos. Behind us, I could hear the creatures thrashing, their bodies breaking down as the power that sustained them was disrupted. The computers exploded one by one, filling the air with sparks and burning paper. But the metal creature's voice followed us up the tunnel. "You can't stop it, brother. The transformation is in your blood now, in all your blood. When the doors open, you'll understand. You'll all understand." We emerged into the snowstorm to find the rest of the squad waiting, weapons ready. They'd heard the explosions and were prepared to come in after us. I ordered an immediate withdrawal and called in an artillery strike on the bunker's location. As we moved out, I caught a glimpse of something falling with the snow, tiny crystals that glowed with that same phosphorescent light. When they hit the ground, they melted instantly, seeping into the earth in patterns that looked eerily like circuitry. Back at base, our story was met with immediate action, but not the kind we expected. Within hours, those same unmarked helicopters I'd seen at FOB Echo arrived. Men in hazmat suits descended into the bunker while others confiscated our equipment and uniforms, anything that might have been exposed to whatever was down there. Then they brought us to a secure room for decontamination. That's when I saw it. The same crystalline growth in Park's eyes that I'd seen in Anderson's. Rodriguez's skin had taken on a metallic sheen in patches, catching the light like pools of mercury, and when I looked in the mirror, I understood the metal creature's words about the transformation being in our blood. My veins were visible through my skin, glowing with that familiar phosphorescent light, tracing patterns that matched the symbols we'd seen in the bunker. An officer I'd never seen before entered the room. He carried a folder marked with both US and Korean classified stamps, dated 1954. Project Amalgam wasn't meant to create enhanced soldiers, he said. That was just the cover story. We found something in those places, those weak spots around the world, something that wanted in, and it offered us a deal. He opened the folder and showed us photographs from military installations around the globe. Each one showed soldiers in various stages of transformation, some dated back to World War I. We thought we could control it, direct the evolution of our species, but we were just opening doors. And now, he turned on a small radio, and my blood ran cold. Through the static, I could hear that familiar humming, but it was stronger now, coming from everywhere at once. Through the window, I saw soldiers looking up at the sky in confusion. That's when Park started screaming. Her eyes had turned completely to crystal, and through them, I could see what she saw. Millions of those symbols appearing in the air itself, burning themselves into reality. The door wasn't just opening anymore. It was already open. I looked down at my hands, watching the metallic sheen spread across my skin, feeling the transformation the creature had promised beginning to take hold. And in that moment, I finally understood what FOB Echo, the radio, and Project Amalgam had all been building toward. This wasn't an invasion or an apocalypse. It was an upgrade. The officer smiled, his teeth gleaming like polished chrome. Welcome to the next phase of human evolution, Sergeant. The amalgamation of flesh and machine of our world and theirs, isn't it beautiful? Through the window, I watched as the snow turned to glowing crystal, as shadows took form and began reshaping everything they touched. And in the distance, something massive was rising from the ground where the bunker had been, something made of living metal and impossible geometries. The last thing I heard before the transformation took hold completely was the officer's voice, distorted by his own changing flesh. Oh my God, they're finally here.